First of all, very many thanks for your kind introduction, Dr. Yazed, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this conference. Very sad not to be with you today, but unfortunately have many other commitments, so I couldn't attend in person. This afternoon session, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the health technology assessment and reimbursement considerations for rare diseases. Next slide, please. So I have no conflicts of interest with this presented material in this presentation. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to cover for you today is a little bit about the rare disease attributes and difficulties. And I know a lot of the speakers today have spoken about this, so I'll try not to labor it too much. Talk to you a little bit about the health technology assessment of rare diseases and learnings that I've had from NICE. I was also fortunate enough to be part of a research project called Impact HTA, which looked at the different appraisal processes and evaluation activities from other countries. So I'd like to share with you some of those examples. And then a paper that I also wrote in co-partnership with other authors around the value assessment principles for orphan therapies. Next slide, please. So the difficulties in developing orphan medicinal products are well known to this community, but just to remind the audience of some of these, you're looking at a challenge in terms of the nature of rare diseases, so very small populations which are heterogeneous in their content. They are frequently genetically acquired, and we've heard a lot about that today. And they have a massive negative impact, not just on patients, but families and carers, and can often be severely disabling or life-threatening, and often appear in children. The drug discovery pathway is also fraught with very difficult challenges because there is lack of knowledge and expertise. Again, a few of the speakers have spoken about how challenging it is to have an understanding of these conditions. And therefore, it's very difficult to run confirmatory trials, which translates into clinical challenges. Then there are needs for incentives in the system in order to enable those drugs to be developed and therapies to be developed. But then that also translates into economic challenges, which means the medicines are of high cost, and the financial burden on patients, families and carers and society to look after these patients can be very high. But that then translates into challenges at the health technology assessment level, where you are often misaligned with the marketing authorization. So the authorization may be given for one population, but the HTA body may be looking at something that's slightly different. The small sample sizes mean that it's difficult to demonstrate statistical power, and the evidence that's generated often creates a large number of uncertainties in the pathway and the care and how that's given, as well as lack of comparative data. A lot of these rare diseases don't have any treatment, so how can you compare whether or not the treatment that you're currently looking at in the health technology assessment space is appropriate and is working better? Limited clinical and patient reported outcomes and health quality of life data can often be a challenge here as well. And the trial duration, because of the challenges in ensuring that the right patients are treated and put into trials, can often be very short. So the data is very short, and therefore that creates a large number of uncertainties. Often the patients are a small subgroup of the totality of the population with a particular disease, and the heterogeneity can cause challenges in understanding that. And that translates into poor value for money. So HTA bodies really struggle to make the right decisions with all of these areas being highly uncertain. Next slide, please. But what is it that we really want to do when we talk about health technology assessment? And previous speakers have spoken about this already. We really want to know, does the product work? And how well does it work? And how much of the quality of life of a patient will improve? So is it clinically effective for patients? But of course, how much does it cost to do that? Is it affordable for the value it brings for the patient, for the healthcare system, as well as for society? And can the health system, or indeed the government in some situations, afford to pay for it? So is it clinically effective and is it cost effective? And that creates the value. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the reflections when you're undertaking health technology assessment for rare disease treatments, we have to acknowledge that each rare disease is unique. So no two rare diseases are the same, but there are some conditions that have similar characteristics. For example, neuromuscular diseases, there are some similar things, for example, in SMA or Duchenne's, where you can understand and learn from each other. In some countries, there'll be no expertise or treatment facility for these patients, and patients are having to travel. I think a previous speaker talked about the European reference networks, a setup that's created whereby patients who don't have treatment facilities in their country can travel to another European country where there is expertise and support. The paucity of clinical evidence means that other forms of evidence and inputs are more important. So when we talk about creating trials or not understanding the natural history of the disease and the clinical pathway, being able to gain evidence from other sources is really important in order to be able to create a really good picture of the condition and the treatment that you're looking at in a HTA context. So we need to consider how we optimally obtain that information and from which sources. And it's clear from the work I've done that there is a need for special criteria to drive every part of the HTA process when you're looking at rare disease treatments. The other thing to really think about is whether decisions and modifications and the willingness to pay threshold needs to be different, or is it more about the societal and ethical issues that need to be considered? Next slide, please. So I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that there are real challenges in determining the value of rare and ultra rare treatments, and that one size, the way we do things for more prevalent conditions, for example, diabetes or cardiovascular disease, doesn't fit in the rare disease scenario. So those traditional methods that we would normally apply for pricing and reimbursement really don't work very well for rare disease treatments. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk you through now the experience that I've had at NICE when I was the Associate Director for the Highly Specialised Programme, and some of the activities that NICE has recently introduced in order to understand and do these things in a different way. Next slide, please. So NICE currently has two programmes that undertake health technology assessment. The first one is the single technology appraisals process, where the willingness to pay is between £20,000 and £30,000 per quali. It evaluates single technologies with single indications, so single marketing authorizations that are close to marketing authorization. They can, in that program, consider rare and more prevalent conditions, and it takes about 9 months to go through that process. Then there's the highly specialized technology program, which potentially evaluates very rare or ultra rare diseases, and the willingness to pay threshold there is much higher at £100,000 to £300,000 per quali. The process is more or less the same in terms of how technologies are evaluated through that activity. However, there's a real acknowledgement in the highly specialized technology program that we want to make sure that those conditions or rare diseases that are very, very rare, where there is lack of incentives for the pharmaceutical industry or others to research in that situation, and to secure a sizable or reasonable return on their investment, we need to incentivize. And the way we incentivize is to understand that through this program, the highly specialized technology program, we should apply some flexibilities in the willingness to pay, in the way we consider the evidence, in the way we interact with expert clinicians and patient groups, and ensure that we are having the right information and the right data to make the right decisions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the highly specialized technology program, it was introduced in 2015, recognizing that these are very rare patients needed to have an approach applied to them for these new technologies that were coming through. And we've heard again from a number of speakers today that there is a massive increase in the number of therapies that are coming through in the rare disease space. But when the program was originally developed, the criteria for entry into the program were quite fluid. They were quite challenging to get into the program. And we didn't have a cost for quality approach in that program at the time. So there was no threshold, no number, or no kind of a framework where pharmaceutical industries who were developing products knew where would things sit and where would the decision be made. So the methods mostly focused on the clinical effectiveness of a particular treatment and the unmet need that patients had in that area. But what that resulted in was inconsistent decision making. So the committees that were looking at these new therapies found it very difficult to be able to say, well, this is what we did last time. Is this the right scenario to do it in this space as well? Lengthy evaluations and lots of lobbying from stakeholders and government pressure to move things forward very, very quickly. Next slide, please. So what do? We ended up introducing a cost per QALY approach to 100,000 and 300,000 pounds a QALY. And the reason that was introduced was because it provides a really good framework to say that the health system at that time and now still can only afford to go up to 300,000 pounds per QALY. And the way they do that is up to 10 QALYs can access 100,000 pounds, and up to a maximum or more than 30 QALYs can access 300,000 pounds per QALY. Again, acknowledging that in the rare disease arena, particularly where there are no therapies, the ability for patients to get a higher quality of life was much more likely in these very rare conditions, because all therapies or any therapy that came through would really enable that to happen very quickly, as well as improve their care. Next slide, please. But what NICE has done recently is acknowledge that because some of those conditions are not very rare, are rare. So let's think about cystic fibrosis or haemophilia. They are still very difficult to undertake a HTA in. So they've introduced a number of different modifiers in their standard approach. They've taken out the end of life criteria that was mentioned in an earlier presentation and replaced it with a severity criteria. And what that means is there's the ability to be able to say that actually this condition is very severe, therefore we need to value it differently, and the patients that are experiencing this severity are going to get a better quality of life if this treatment is made available. There's also an acceptance that there are a number of uncertainties in the rare disease space that we need to think about. And so the methods accommodate for improving how uncertainty is handled within evaluations, thinking about how we characterize it. So, for example, is it economic uncertainty? Is it a clinical uncertainty? Is it around the trials not doing a very good job? And really being able to understand what that looks like. And then thinking about removing those barriers through flexibilities in those considerations. So saying, for example, this population is extremely rare, so it would be unfair to expect some statistical significant figure to come out of that. It would be unethical, for example, to undertake a trial in more than 5 patients if it's a very small population. So really giving the committee the ability to apply those flexibilities. And then being more open to a more comprehensive evidence base. So traditionally, randomized controlled trials have been the gold standard, and they still remain so. However, really, really important to think about other types of evidence that can be put forward. For example, clinical testimonies, patient testimonies, thinking about collecting Delphi panels and using those to inform the economic modelling. Next slide, please. And then I've talked a little about the other modifiers. So expert opinion. So experts in the rare disease space often know much more about what is going on with their patients and what is going on with them as patients. So really using a structured approach to capture that qualitative data and eliciting that feedback from experts into the modelling and present to NICE as a narrative. And describe those methods used. So have you used a Delphi panel? Have you used questionnaires? What kind of things have you used? Then understanding that in these rare conditions, traditionally using EQ5D, which may not be applicable in this rare disease, using other measures might be appropriate. So being more accepting about how you can use them, and also taking into account that children and young people might be needed to be considered differently because their thoughts and their process and the way that they accept or want or need therapy may be different to an adult. and taking into account considerations around carers, the impact of quality of life on carers. And then qualitative evidence, thinking about how you can capture more qualitative narrative stories around how patients and clinicians are experiencing giving care and receiving care. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on some research that I was really grateful enough to be part of. Next slide, please. Thank you. This research was a European grant called Impact HTA, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of a collaborator looking at appraisal processes for orphan diseases. Next slide, please. The work package, the Impact HTA work package had a number of different elements to it, but I was lucky enough to be work package 10. So looking at the appraisal of medicines for rare diseases. And the approach was to think about how we could develop methods, tools, and guidance for decision makers in the context of HTA and health system performance. Next slide, please. So what did we do in this scenario? Well, what we did when we undertook the research, we undertook 4 different themes. The first one was to look at different countries and think about whether those appraisal processes of those medicines for rare diseases were different, and why were they different? Well, where were they different? Then we observed a number of different committees across a number of different geographies to think about and assess how did they undertake these assessments and what did they do differently and what did we learn from that? We also undertook an activity to think about how to better use patient-reported outcome measures and utilities in an appraisal process. And then we looked at managed entry agreements, when to use them, how to implement them, and what's the kind of criteria to apply when you're thinking about entering into these conversations. So we developed an appraisal framework with associated toolkits in these 4 different work streams. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize, we had a number of different countries who participated in the early exercise, and 41% of the 32 participating countries had some form of HTA appraisal process that was looking at rare diseases slightly differently. So you can see that England and Lithuania have separate processes, and then the other countries have partially or adapted processes or expedited processes where treatments are given a different approach to rare diseases. Next slide, please. So what did we end up doing? We ended up creating an appraisal framework that's suitable for rare disease treatments, but actually could also be suitable for complex therapies. And what we discovered in this scenario is if you think about starting at the evidence submission stage and working your way through the appraisal deliberation, that there was a need for leniency in critical assessment.
Sorry for interrupting you, but only 1 minute left, please, if you can wrap up.
Of course. So you need to ensure you're addressing all the dimensions of value and identifying the uncertainty, thinking about all the different considerations of value, so not just around the randomized controlled trials, but all of the other evidence, and explaining that context and condition. But one of the key things that we picked up here was there was a need for consistency and flexibility and leniency, and ensuring that clinicians and patients were involved throughout the appraisals process and the development of the drug process. The next slide, please. So I won't go through these. I'm sure these slides will be shared with colleagues. And just the last slide, please, if you don't mind. One more. Yep. These are orphan value principles, and then each rare disease is unique. We've talked about this. We can't apply the same approach. There's a need to include patients and clinical experts throughout the evaluation. We can't be seen to know it all. We need to seek advice. We need to ensure other forms of evidence are included in a HTA evaluation, and the committee assessing the product should have some experience in rare diseases. There is a need for special criteria to drive every part of the HTA process, and modifiers and adaptations in willingness to pay could be a solution. But each healthcare system should develop methods and approaches that suit them and their societal values. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheela, for the interesting and informative presentation. Now we'll open the floor for questions.
Happy to take any questions
can take
if there are any.
1 to 2 questions. If there are any, actually, one who wants to raise a question to Dr. Sheela. All right. If there isn't, I have one question to Dr. Sheela, as she always enlightens us with interesting and new information about different health technology assessment methods. Dr. Sheela, I have a question about using the cost effectiveness threshold in assessing the value of any new technology. Is it something feasible to use when we talk about orphan drugs, especially for rare diseases? As you have rightly mentioned, each rare disease has its unique actual presentations. Would you please elaborate on that?
Sure. I think for me, the cost effectiveness threshold approach is a tool and not a rule. And I think my experience of a number of HTA bodies is they use it as a rule. So if you meet that criteria, you get approved. If you don't meet it, you're not approved. I think that we need to be using that as a guide, and then adding all the other elements around the societal impact, the effect on families and carers, the kind of qualitative evidence, to then decide as a society whether this treatment is appropriate for patients. But I personally would feel it's more of a tool to assist and guide, because of course we've also talked about today how expensive some of these new therapies are, and we can't all afford to pay for these therapies, but we also need to make sure society is getting value from it. So I think that we should use it as a tool to guide us, but not to be a rule to say yes or no.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheela, for the actually kind reply and pretty informative as well. If there are any more questions, if there aren't any questions, we will proceed. Thank you so much, Dr. Sheela, for the informative presentation. We look forward to having you here in Saudi Arabia so you can have the opportunity to discuss multiple topics related to health technology assessment of orphan drugs.